Welcome to the 700 Club. Thanks so much for joining with us today. Well, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth sparred with House Democrats during a hearing on the Iran war yesterday. At one point, the Secretary asked the lawmakers, "Who are you pulling for?"
President Trump says the U.S. naval blockade is putting so much pressure on the Iranian regime that more fighting might not be necessary. CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has more.
President Trump praised the naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz.
The blockade is genius, okay? The blockade has been 100% foolproof. It shows how good our Navy is, I can tell you that. Nobody's going to play games.
He says negotiations are continuing with Iran by telephone, and he doesn't know if another round of fighting will be necessary.
They've come a long way. The question is whether or not they're going to go far enough. So at this moment, there will never be a deal unless they agree that there will be no nuclear weapons.
However, there are reports that CENTCOM will brief the president on potential short and powerful strikes on Iran, as well as a plan to take over parts of the Strait of Hormuz to open it to commercial shipping. The Pentagon says the war is estimated to cost $25 billion so far, mostly in munitions.
President Trump, unlike other presidents, has had the courage to ensure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, and he's ironclad in that.
Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth defended the war at a House Armed Services Committee hearing against accusations from Democrats that the U.S. has been drawn into a quagmire.
Don't say I support the troops on one hand and then a 2-month mission is a quagmire. That's a false equivalation. Who are you cheering for here? Who are you pulling for? Our troops are doing incredible work. They've done incredible things for the entirety of this mission and achieved incredible battlefield successes.
Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford reportedly is due to leave the Red Sea and set sail for home soon. The ship has been deployed for more than 300 days, including operations in Venezuela and Iran. The move represents a significant loss of firepower in the Middle East at a time when tensions are still high. In London, another sign of growing anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom. The Metropolitan Police said that a stabbing attack of 2 Jewish men in a Jewish neighborhood has now formally been declared a terrorist incident.
There's been a series of incidents over the last 4 or 5 weeks. An attack against an ambulance, Jewish charity, 2 or 3 attacks against Jewish synagogues. But today's somewhat worse because it's a physical attack against 2 human beings. So it's a completely different ball game at the moment. So, you know, it's much worse.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, in the backdrop of rising global anti-Semitism, rising global anti-Israel sentiment, where within the Democrat Party, if you're a Jewish lawmaker, you're getting questions about where does your loyalty really lie? Does it really lie with the U.S. or does it rely on Israel? Questions that were unthinkable just a few years ago are now out there, and there's some kind of litmus test that in the Democrat primary, unless you say what happened in Gaza is a genocide, unless you take that position, they're saying, well, you're not going to get elected. In that backdrop, I think the Secretary's question to Democrats in the House of Representatives is quite legitimate. Who are you rooting for? And this whole narrative that somehow or other we're losing the war, or it's some kind of quagmire, or we've been outsmarted by the Iranians, that we didn't anticipate the Strait of Hormuz would be blocked and oil would be at $100 a barrel. In all of that narrative, the victory has been absolutely stunning. And when you take a look at it militarily, the Iranian government no longer has a Navy, no longer has an Air Force, has clearly run out of missiles because they're not launching them anymore. They may still have some drones, but that is open to question. Can they even manufacture them anymore? The piece that remains is, can we finally overthrow that ideology and have it no longer in charge of that oil money, no longer in charge of such amazing resources that they're able to fund Hezbollah and Hamas and terror groups throughout the Middle East? Their neighbors are all saying, please continue until you achieve that. we ought to really listen to them. I do not understand internally in the United States any kind of opposition to this. Both Democrats and Republicans for decades have vowed Iran can never get a nuclear weapon. In the negotiations right before this war, they were boasting they were weeks away. And they were talking about how many kilograms they had and how many weapons. You do the math real quickly, and that was like over 10 warheads. You look at that and go, how in the world can you ever support that? How can you be rooting for them? As if somehow, anybody that gets a victory over Trump is some kind of good guy. Are you kidding me? These guys have vowed to destroy us. They want to take out Israel, then they want to take out the United States. We absolutely, as a people, need to be unified. Let's finish this job. Let's not back off until we are absolutely sure they will never get a weapon. And from where I'm sitting, let's make sure they're not in power anymore. That would be a game changer for the entire region and for the entire world. Well, in other news, global oil prices are over $100 a barrel. Cost of a gallon of gasoline hit a record high in the U.S. this year. John Jessup has that story and more from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
And that is right, Gordon. Gas prices continue to rise across the country. The national average for a gallon sits at $4.30. That is up more than 20 cents compared to last week. Just a year ago, the national gas price was $3.18. Rising prices are one reason behind the Federal Reserve's decision not to lower interest rates yesterday. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell also announced he will not resign from the Fed's Board of Governors after his term ends in 2028. In his final press conference as chairman, Powell said he'll remain on the board, quote, until the Justice Department probe is resolved. The DOJ recently agreed to drop its criminal investigation into allegations that he gave false testimony to Congress over an office renovation. Powell said he intends to stay until the investigation is, quote, well and truly over with finality and transparency. Well, the Supreme Court releasing two consequential rulings yesterday. In a 6-3 decision, the justices ruled against racial gerrymandering in drawing up voting districts. The decision weakens a provision of the Voting Rights Act. A second decision handed down yesterday has pro-life groups celebrating as a chain of crisis pregnancy centers won a unanimous victory. CBN's Lori Johnson has more on these two important cases.
The High Court unanimously sided with New Jersey's First Choice Women's Resource Centers in its fight against a state investigation requiring them to hand over their donor list. Alliance Defending Freedom's Erin Hawley represented the pregnancy centers before the High Court. She called the ruling a resounding victory, saying the Constitution protects First Choice and its donors from demands by a hostile state office. First Choice adding the Supreme Court recognized the government can't harass those who support pro-life ministries.
So as we're going into Mother's Day, this is a time when we should be celebrating moms and celebrating organizations that are helping moms.
Pro-life leaders say the ruling sets an important precedent.
We are so grateful to First Choice Women's Resource Centers for their willingness to stand up against these aggressive actions.
Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, also involved in the case, said the ruling assures citizens their privacy will be protected.
It limits the ability of the government to go after the lists of donors and people who partner with organizations like First Choice or other really important nonprofits that are doing incredible work, but might be touching in controversial areas.
In addition to the pregnancy center ruling, the Supreme Court handed down its opinion on another important yet divisive issue: voter districting maps. In a 6-3 decision, the conservative justices struck down a majority black congressional district in Louisiana that stretches more than 200 miles from Shreveport to Baton Rouge, saying it relied too heavily on race. In the majority opinion, Justice Samuel Alito wrote, that map is an unconstitutional gerrymander. The ruling weakens Section 2 of the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, aimed at reducing discrimination in voting. In a dissent for the 3 liberal justices, Elena Kagan wrote, the consequences are likely to be far-reaching and grave. Today's decision renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. The ruling comes as states nationwide are redrawing maps to gain partisan advantage in the midterm elections. Wednesday, the Florida legislature became the latest state to approve a congressional map. It gives Republicans an edge. Florida joins 9 other states, some majority Democrat and some majority Republican, to create new district boundaries for elected offices to increase the potential for their party to gain seats in the House of Representatives and impact the balance of power in Washington. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
The redistricting race is on. Thank you, Lori. Gordon, back over to you.
Well, that donor privacy ruling by the Supreme Court, I can't underline how important that is. What was happening was a state agency wanted disclosure, and why they wanted a disclosure, they were hostile to it. And they wanted to make sure that they could cut off the funding. That is part of a long-term strategy. Now, go back to Prop 8, in Proposition 8 in California, which was designed to honor marriage and make same-sex marriage unconstitutional in the state of California. It passed. To my amazement, the Ninth Circuit said a vote on a state constitutional amendment by the population that was unconstitutional under the federal Constitution, and so it got overturned. But any donor to support Prop 8 was then public record. And in that, they all lost their jobs. And it became very serious, even in Silicon Valley. And what does a tech company have to do with same-sex marriage? But they lost their jobs. And that's what the left is trying to do. It's the origin of what we call cancel culture, where they're trying to deprive you of your civil liberties just because you speak up in the public square and say, I want to defend traditional marriage. I want to defend the right of infants to be born. I want to have facilities available that will encourage mothers to give birth. And in that, they want to target you. So it's wonderful the Supreme Court has ruled, no, these are private records. You don't get to go after them. You don't get to have this kind of disclosure. I couldn't applaud it more. There's also a very well-established precedent for it. So if you think it's some kind of new ruling, think again. The Federal Election Commission, when it was formed, there was a carve-out for the Communist Party. The Communist Party did not have to disclose their donors. I think it was on the basis that, well, they weren't really going to have any influence, but there would be obvious persecution against any donor to the Communist Party. So those records were sealed. They weren't ever publicly disclosed. The Supreme Court said yes to that. So you look at these things. How do we protect minority interests? But most importantly, how do we protect the ability for people to have influence in the public square, influence based on the dictates of their conscience? That's a fundamental American right. We need to always uphold it.